She thought it was just a tattoo, an expression of pride, a piece of art carrying her heritage on her skin. But the moment the SEAL forces saw it, the air changed. Laughter echoed in the training yard, sharp and cruel, their voices cutting deeper than any weapon. They mocked her, ridiculed her, reduced her story to a joke before she even had the chance to explain. To them, she was just a black woman daring to wear a symbol they thought she had no right to claim. But what they didn't know, what none of them expected, was that the ink on her arm carried a history tied to power, sacrifice, and honor far greater than any of their shallow judgments. And when the highest-ranking general walked in, the truth written on his own skin silenced the room. Why was her tattoo the very thing that turned ridicule into respect? And what hidden truth forced even the strongest soldiers to bow their heads? It began like any other morning on base. The sound of boots striking pavement, the crisp air of discipline, the hum of soldiers training in perfect rhythm. For most, this was routine, a world of order, rules, and unshakable hierarchy. But for Maya, it was different. She wasn't just another face in the crowd. She carried a story on her skin, a piece of history that few understood but that defined every step she took. Maya was strong, not because she wanted to be noticed, but because she had no other choice. Growing up, she had learned that being a black woman in uniform meant proving herself twice as hard, standing twice as tall, and never letting her guard down. Every salute, every drill, every sleepless night, she wore them like invisible medals no one ever pinned to her chest. Yet, beneath the toughness, there was pride. A pride etched into her very arm, in the form of a tattoo that wasn't just ink, but a story, a legacy from her family, a reminder that she belonged, even in places that tried to push her out. She never flaunted it. She didn't need to. To her, it was sacred. But in an environment where every difference was magnified, it was only a matter of time before someone noticed. That day, when the SEAL forces gathered in the yard, Maya stood tall, as she always did. The sun hit her arm just right, and the design caught their eyes. At first, it was curiosity. A glance. A whisper. But whispers have a way of growing louder. Soon, they would become something else, something far crueler. And Maya had no idea that this ordinary morning was about to spiral into an ordeal that would test not only her strength, but the very meaning of respect, loyalty, and honor in the military's most disciplined ranks. Because what looked like simple ink to some, was about to expose truths that no one expected. The sun was high over the base when it started. At first, it seemed harmless, just a few glances in her direction, a couple of smirks that Maya had learned long ago to ignore. She had dealt with whispers before, the kind that always followed her into new spaces. Being the only black woman in a sea of hardened men, she was used to eyes lingering too long, words muttered too quietly. But this time, it was different. This time, the glances weren't about her presence, they were about her arm. The tattoo had been exposed as she rolled up her sleeve to wipe the sweat from her face after drills. A sharp, clean design inked into her skin, dark lines woven together into a symbol with a history deeper than anyone around her could imagine. To Maya, it was more than art, it was her family's sacrifice. Her grandfather had carried the same emblem in the jungles of Vietnam, etched into his shoulder by the very men he had bled beside. Her father had carried it, too, on his forearm, a mark of brotherhood, resilience, and survival through years when loyalty didn't come easy. Now, Maya carried it forward, the ink a quiet promise that she would honor the path laid before her. But to the SEAL forces watching her that day, it was nothing but a target. Laughter broke out in small bursts. One man nudged another, pointing at the mark. A mocking grin spread across faces that should have been hardened by discipline but instead twisted with cruel amusement. To them, it wasn't history. It wasn't sacrifice. It was funny. A woman, black, no less, daring to wear something sacred to their brotherhood. The laughter grew louder, more open. Words followed. She thinks she's one of us. Bet she got it at some cheap parlor downtown. Probably doesn't even know what it means. Each comment was a blade, each smirk a wound deeper than the ink itself. Maya's stomach tightened, her chest heavy with the weight of eyes cutting into her. She tried to focus on her breathing, on keeping her face calm, her shoulders square. She had learned long ago never to let them see her break. But inside, a storm raged. They didn't know the truth. They didn't know that the blood of men who had earned that mark ran in her veins. They didn't know that her grandfather had been denied medals he deserved because of his skin, or that her father had been told, more than once, that the ink on his body didn't belong on a man like him. They didn't know that every line in that tattoo carried scars that weren't visible, but lived on in her every step. And still, they laughed. It didn't stop there. The whispers turned to jeers. During drills, some of them deliberately stepped into her space, making snide remarks loud enough for everyone to hear. Careful, don't trip over her tattoo. Wonder if that ink comes with a free pass to respect. The chuckles followed her everywhere, into the mess hall, into the barracks, onto the training field. At night, she lay awake staring at the ceiling, fists clenched, replaying every word, every sneer. She had been through challenges before. She had endured instructors doubting her, peers underestimating her. But this was different. It wasn't about her ability. It wasn't about her discipline. It was about stripping her identity, mocking the very symbol that held her family's honor. The more they pressed, the more isolated she felt. Even those who didn't mock her directly stayed silent, their eyes averting whenever the ridicule began. Silence, Maya realized, was just another form of betrayal. And then came the moment that pushed everything to the edge. During a weapons drill, with the entire unit gathered, one of the SEALs shouted across the yard, "Hey, Maya. Show us that fancy ink of yours again. We could use a good laugh." The men roared with laughter, the sound bouncing off steel and concrete. Maya froze, the heat rising to her face, her pulse thundering in her ears. For a split second, she thought about covering her arm, hiding the tattoo as if it were something to be ashamed of. But then she remembered her grandfather's voice, gravelly and steady, "Never let them take what's yours." She kept her chin high. She said nothing. But silence, in that moment, only fed the mockery. By the end of the day, the tattoo wasn't just a mark on her arm, it had become a symbol of division. To them, it was a joke. To her, it was a burden she carried alone. And then, word reached higher ranks. Maya didn't know it yet, but someone had reported the incident, not to defend her, but to laugh about it. The story of the black woman with the fake tattoo traveled faster than wildfire through the base. It reached offices it was never meant to reach. And one set of ears it landed on belonged to the last man anyone expected to care. The general. He had heard the whispers before. But this time, something made him pause. He wanted to see for himself. He wanted to know what kind of woman carried a mark that had suddenly become the subject of ridicule in his ranks. And when the general stepped onto the yard the next morning, silence fell. Boots stopped moving. Voices died out. Every soldier straightened as if pulled by invisible strings. Maya stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest, unaware of what was about to unfold. What the soldiers didn't know, what Maya herself didn't know, was that the truth was about to be revealed in a way that would turn the ridicule on its head. Because the same ink they mocked on her arm was carved into the general's own skin. The yard was still. The kind of silence that doesn't come from peace, but from tension so thick it presses on every chest. Soldiers stood frozen, their eyes darting between Maya and the general who had just entered. No one laughed now. No one dared. Maya felt the heat of their stares, her stomach tightening as though the ground beneath her had shifted. She didn't know why the general was here, why his gaze seemed locked on her arm, unblinking. For a moment, she thought this was the end. That the ridicule had reached its breaking point, and that punishment would fall, not on them, but on her. The general stepped closer, his boots echoing like thunder. Each strike against the concrete sounded heavier than the last, until he stopped directly before her. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His silence was weight enough to crush the laughter still hanging in the air. And then, with steady hands, he reached for his sleeve. Slowly, deliberately, he rolled it back. The crowd leaned forward, breaths caught in unison. And there it was, the same ink, etched into his skin, aged and weathered but unmistakable. The same lines, the same design that Maya bore on her arm. Gasps rippled through the ranks. Soldiers who had jeered now stared wide-eyed, their faces pale with realization. What they had mocked so freely was carved into the flesh of the very man who commanded them. But the general wasn't finished. His voice broke the silence like a blade. This mark is not a joke. It is not decoration. It is history. It is sacrifice. It is blood. He looked at Maya, then back at the men. His words grew sharper, heavier, slicing through the shame that now blanketed the yard. When I was younger than most of you, I served alongside a man who carried this same ink. He was my brother in arms. He fought with me, bled with me, saved my life more times than I can count. And yet, when we came home, the world didn't salute him. They spat at him. They told him he didn't belong. Why? Because his skin was dark. The soldiers shifted uneasily, their eyes fixed on the ground, the weight of history pressing down on them. The general's tone hardened. That man was her grandfather. And his son, her father, wore this same mark in service. They carried it when it was dangerous to do so. They carried it when men like you would have laughed, or worse. And now she carries it. Not for vanity. Not for pride. But because it is her bloodline's legacy. A legacy you mocked without understanding. Maya's throat tightened, her chest burning as the truth she had carried alone was finally spoken aloud, not by her, but by the most respected voice in the entire base. And then came the blow that silenced the last trace of arrogance. The general's voice dropped lower, but every word struck like a hammer. When you laughed at her, you laughed at me. The weight of those words shattered the yard. Heads dropped. Shoulders stiffened. Some faces flushed red with shame, others pale with fear. No one dared move. No one dared speak. Maya stood frozen, her heart racing, a storm of emotions flooding her, relief, vindication, pain. She had endured their cruelty, carried their silence like chains. And now, in a single moment, the balance had shifted. But the general wasn't done. He stepped closer to the group, scanning every face with eyes that seemed to burn through them. This mark is not a privilege for you to grant. It is not yours to own, to decide who is worthy. It belongs to those who earn it, through courage, through sacrifice, through blood. And she has earned it, just as her family before her did. More than some of you ever will. The silence grew heavier, pressing against the walls, against every soldier's chest. No one laughed now. No one smirked. Their cruelty had been exposed under the harshest light possible, their arrogance stripped bare. And yet, beneath the vindication, Maya felt something else rising inside her. A raw, unshakable truth. Because this wasn't just about her. This wasn't just about the ink on her arm. This was about generations who had carried marks, visible or not, that the world refused to honor. It was about every soldier who fought twice as hard to prove half as much. The general's words rang in her ears, "When you laughed at her, you laughed at me." And as Maya stood there, unbroken, the yard thick with silence, a single thought burned in her mind. If respect had to be forced by power, had anything truly changed at all? The yard never felt the same after that day. The echoes of laughter that once followed Maya everywhere were gone, replaced by something else, silence heavy with shame. For weeks, soldiers avoided her eyes, their mockery replaced with an uneasy respect they didn't know how to show. The tattoo they once ridiculed now carried a weight none of them could deny, not because it had changed, but because the truth behind it had been revealed. But for Maya, the moment of vindication didn't erase the scars. It didn't erase the nights she lay awake, listening to their laughter replaying in her head. It didn't erase the sting of being reduced to a joke in front of those who were supposed to be her brothers in arms. And though the general's words had silenced them, Maya knew silence was not the same as understanding. That realization stayed with her. Because what haunted her most wasn't just the cruelty of their ridicule, it was how easily it had spread. How quickly men who prided themselves on loyalty, discipline, and honor had turned their strength into mockery. It wasn't one man's laughter. It was all of them. The ones who jeered, the ones who smirked, the ones who stood silent. Every role played its part. Maya carried that weight as she continued her service. She carried it in every salute, every drill, every long march under the sun. She carried it because it wasn't just her burden, it was her family's. Her grandfather had been mocked when he came home in uniform. Her father had been dismissed as less than even after earning the right to stand among men who hadn't endured half of what he had. And now her turn had come. Different time. Different place. Same struggle. But she also carried something else. Strength. The kind of strength born not from applause or recognition, but from surviving the storm of disrespect and still standing tall. She knew she had walked through fire and come out the other side unbroken. And though scars remained, they were reminders of resilience, not defeat. The general's words had left an imprint, not just on the soldiers who heard them, but on Maya herself. When you laughed at her, you laughed at me. In that sentence, generations of silence had been broken. For once, power had spoken in her defense. And though she wished it hadn't taken his voice to validate her truth, she couldn't deny the shift it created. But the bigger question lingered: why did it take his voice at all? Why did her truth need to be echoed by someone in power before it was respected? Why was her history only sacred when spoken from his lips? Those questions weren't just about Maya. They were about every person who had ever been dismissed, doubted, or degraded because of the color of their skin. They were about every soldier who had been told they didn't belong in the very uniform they wore. They were about every family that had sacrificed for a country that didn't always sacrifice for them. And so, Maya's story is not just hers. It is a window into a much larger truth, that racism is not always shouted in the streets or carved into laws. Sometimes it whispers in laughter. Sometimes it hides in silence. Sometimes it disguises itself as jokes or tradition. And every time it goes unchallenged, it grows bolder, until it leaves marks not just on skin, but on hearts. The tattoo on Maya's arm will never fade. Neither will the memory of that day. But what she chooses to do with it, that is where the impact lies. Because she knows that her silence would have been their victory. Her endurance, her pride, her refusal to let their mockery define her, that is her resistance. And for those who watched that moment unfold, whether in the yard or through the retelling of this story, the question remains: what will you do when you see injustice? Will you laugh? Will you stay silent? Or will you stand, even when it costs you? Because the truth is, Maya's story is not rare. It repeats in barracks, in classrooms, in offices, on sidewalks. It repeats in moments we call small, but that carry wounds that never heal. And if we dismiss them as just words, we miss the truth, that words shape the world we live in. They create the silence that allows injustice to thrive. Maya's tattoo was mocked until the general revealed his own. But what about the millions who carry marks without protection? Who speaks for them when power stays silent? This is not just about one woman, one yard, or one day. This is about the reality that racism is woven into the fabric of spaces meant to protect and unite us. And until we face it, name it, and break it, it will keep finding new ways to show itself. So as you finish this story, don't let it fade into the background of another forgotten tale. Ask yourself, how many more Mayas must endure ridicule before respect is given freely, not forced by authority? How many more legacies must be mocked before we recognize their worth? The next time you see someone being diminished for who they are, remember Maya. Remember her silence in the face of laughter. Remember her strength when truth was revealed. And remember that justice doesn't come from waiting for the general to arrive, it comes from each of us deciding that laughter, silence, and cruelty have no place in our ranks, our streets, or our world. Because racism doesn't end with one speech. It ends when we stop allowing it to begin. And so the question remains, when the moment comes, will you stay silent, or will you stand?